the Indian chapter. It's an idea whose time has come. Venkat Iyer is not here. Please congratulate him for doing this. And there's no more appropriate place for that to happen than in India. Thank you very much.
You can announce it, sir.
May I request Mr. Kamalesh Sharma, along with the eminent panelists, to please release the Indian copy of the round table.
It's here. You could be in the house.
You should have tried your hair. She was here a few days ago. I wish she said I mean something you get and then I'm coming to be had and I've been sorry for
May I request Professor James Mayall for his 15-minute remarks, please. Thank you.
I was just saying I feel very inadequate to kick off the Brexit discussion. As a member of the chorus, I thought I would follow the lead star, but I will do my best. Just a couple of points following Kamalesh's remarks. He said that India and the Commonwealth were joined at the hip, going back to the London Declaration. And that took me back to the Trinidad CHOGM in 2009, where at these occasions the Round Table always holds a dinner, and on that occasion it was addressed by the former Secretary General, Sonny Ramphal, who spent the whole talk lamenting that Ireland did not come back into the Commonwealth, on the grounds that there was no need for it to have left, and that India had, after all, shown it the way of joining. Well, there are some Irishmen who agree with that, but I wouldn't put money on it myself. I also agreed very strongly with something that Kamalesh said, which, well, I'll put it in slightly different ways. I would say if the Commonwealth didn't exist, it would not be necessary to invent it. But it does exist. And it is, I think, for reasons that he explained, an extraordinarily useful organization, even if at the margin. And sometimes in London we feel that India, which has played a very full part in the Secretariat, doesn't quite appreciate that. Let's say it appreciates it at the level of participation in the various Commonwealth activities, but it isn't really, frankly, a very serious concern of Indian foreign policy. And we always wish that it would be taken rather more seriously. Well, so much for just comments on our previous speaker. If I turn to Brexit and the Commonwealth, the most obvious thing to notice straight away is the extraordinary contrast between Commonwealth attitudes to Britain's opening to the EEC when it came to realize that the European Free Trade Area could not cover its interests in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, and the attitude of other Commonwealth countries to the referendum on the 23rd of June this year. In the first case, there was very understandable consternation. After all, this was still a world, didn't affect India so much, which under the industrial policy was rather a contained economy at the time. But for many parts of the Commonwealth, in the late 1960s, the trading world was a world of Commonwealth preferences and established long-term links, primary links between Commonwealth countries and the former metropole. So there was general and understandable consternation. 40 years later, the situation was completely different. There wasn't a single Commonwealth country which was in favour of Britain leaving the EU. And that is an extraordinary contrast. And it is also a contrast with the difference, the changing Commonwealth opinion and the remarkable consistency of British public opinion. Euroscepticism has been a leitmotif of British politics almost from the beginning. And I agree with the LSE article, which I haven't read, that it's not about, primarily, it's not about economics. Although you wouldn't have guessed that if you had been present in the referendum. One of the most ridiculous things about the referendum on both sides, and I emphasize on both sides, was that it was discussed completely in purely economic terms, as though one could conceivably have decided arguments of that complexity in a yes-no vote. It was in fact a duel based on sentiment. I think to understand it, one has to go back to right at the beginning, when Harold Macmillan, the then Prime Minister, decided, and of course he'd known it ever since the Suez fiasco in 1956, he decided that there had to be a realignment of Britain geopolitically. But he also knew that he had no chance at all of selling that to his party faithful, particularly in the Shires. On the Labour side, there was huge, probably even more than on the Conservative side, huge Euroscepticism. They thought, many in the Labour Party, thought of Europe as a cartel of bosses against workers' rights. In the Conservative Party, the opinion was more split, but there were many people who were anti-American and thought that somehow the Commonwealth could indeed be the empire dressed up in to continue the framework of activity that had existed when London ruled a quarter of mankind. That, of course, what I'm saying is that there was a political necessity driving the Conservative leadership, which knew that its future must lie in Europe, not to mention the geopolitical realities. And geopolitical realities were not mentioned at all in the referendum debate. It was purely on the one side about how well we would get all the money we would get back, which we could refund the health service with, and on the other this absurd scare campaign, which they couldn't know whether it was going to be true or not. So there was lying and grotesque sort of obfuscation, it seems to me, on both sides. And of course the reason why we went in was sold to the party faithful was the idea that there would be a quick fix to the British economic disease, which was what everyone talked about in the late 1960s and early 1970s. My own position, I ought to say, but you can find it in this volume, is on record. I wrote 2 opinion pieces, one before the Malta CHOGM, which appeared in this journal, and then another one here. I was very reluctant, but Venkat bullied me. And my position is that not of an expert, but of a concerned citizen. It seems to me that referenda are really very dubious ways of conducting business in representative democracies. And we've seen that in this fascinating play, which is now been going on in the Supreme Court this last week, and which we're going to have to wait apparently to January to know the results of. I think you can't, it's no good saying that you can take decisions by referenda, but you can't unknit 40-odd years of very complex international relationships in a vote like that. Now, having said that, although I was strongly of the Remain camp, and that's where I would still be, I think that the lessons of the referendum, just as the lessons of what's happened in the recent presidential election in the United States, really have to be taken seriously by people who I guess are well represented in this room and certainly in my own country. I mean, the liberal intelligentsia, which I don't know, I include myself amongst the intelligentsia, but I would hope to be liberal, were all on the Remain side. They completely got it wrong. And I'm saying nothing original, everyone is saying this now. The huge gap which exists between a very large section of ordinary people, the population, and the government and professional elites is, I think, the thing you have to look at. Is, as I say, this isn't an original observation, everybody is saying it. What unfortunately everyone, including myself, is not saying is what you do about it. How do you reconnect? And that is extraordinarily difficult. And I think if you go to, I've got an American friend who says that Donald Trump's success or failure will depend on whether he can actually do something for the Rust Belt, the blue-collar working class people who flocked to vote for him in the Rust Belt. Now, can he do that without tearing up international obligations? That's a huge question. Can we, I mean, already it's become clear, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer said so yesterday, I understand. It's quite clear that it's very unlikely that we can negotiate an easy, what we would want, soft Brexit. If I was a European, I don't think I would be terribly in favour of a soft Brexit, particularly with the political mood elsewhere in Europe going the way it is. Why should they give Britain, I mean, this position that Britain somehow, other countries need us much more than we need them. Well, it depends what the currency is, what you're trading in. So I'm not convinced by that. I think that we really do have to take enormously seriously this populist challenge, and I'm hoping that I've heard people here, since I've been here the last few days, say that demonetization is the Indian version of populism. Since when you look at the long queues waiting to get their cash. It's a sort of slightly perverse bit of populism, but I suppose I understand the way the argument works. But what I do think, and I'm afraid, and I know there will be many economic experts in this room who will want to discuss what it's going to mean in economic terms. I think we have to be honest. I mean, in my piece, I've said on that issue that we better refer to Wittgenstein. About that which you cannot speak, stay silent. The one thing that was clear was that there would be turbulence afterwards. Of course there would be turbulence. How could there not have been turbulence? But whether in 2, 3, 5 years, the world will realign, Britain will have found these new opportunities, which we must hope it does, or whether, on the other hand, the costs will have escalated, it will have triggered more and more rather unattractive policies in the rest of Europe and so on, that we don't know. But I do think, and the other piece of I don't go in for heroes, but if I had a hero, it would be the veteran French diplomat Talleyrand, who, if you go even now to the Travellers Club in Pall Mall, you will see the worn plate which was placed on the special rail. He was so old when he became ambassador, he'd survived everything, the terror, Napoleon, the lot. And he said, above all, not too much zeal. And that, I think, is the real lesson of Brexit. If you open up the Google to look at the latest entry on the Supreme Court finding, you'll see pictures of young people, and with huge banners outside the Supreme Court saying Brexit is racism. There were reports immediately after the vote that there had been 69% increase in racist incidents. No doubt there had been an increase. I very much doubt whether they knew whether it was 69% or not. There'd always been. Who thinks that there was no racism in Britain before Brexit? This is a question of people reporting rather than necessarily a real change in the situation. And I think we ought to resist the sort of enthusiasm of saying that Britain is about to become a fascist state, or the equal enthusiasm which says, look, utopia is round the corner, and we are suddenly going to recapture this sort of lone wolf dominance that we once had. Neither of these things are remotely likely, and we shouldn't give them the time of day. We should work carefully to try and mend our own fences and keep Britain a relatively decent society. I mean, I think one of the problems with the EU, and I'll finish this, is like all international organizations, it may be necessary, but you can't really love it. The great thing about countries is that you can both love and hate them. And if you're intelligent, you usually do both, to your own particularly, depending on the issue and so on. And I think we need to keep that measure and remember Talleyrand's advice. We need to keep a steady hand and work at it slowly and without panic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for those insightful remarks. Now may I request Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, author and former Under Secretary, for his remarks. 15 minutes.
Oh, less, I think.
Dr. Kathuria, Professor Mayall, Mr. Datta-Ray, friends, I think, as I was just saying to Dr. Kathuria, I don't think I'll need 15 minutes on this topic. Since Kamalesh, I think, took my 15 minutes, I'll take his 5 or find something a little around that. And I do want to appreciate Professor Mayall's very interesting remarks just before this, and his reference to Talleyrand's quote about surtout pas trop de zèle. not too much zeal, which I suppose translates now as let's avoid any Brexitement today. And I think we might just try and look calmly and perhaps somewhat realistically at what this issue means to all of us today. Kamalesh Sharma had talked about India and the Commonwealth being joined to the hip. In many ways, they were really joined at the umbilical cord, because when India became independent, there was this question of whether it could continue in the Commonwealth, and the creative formula identified by Nehru and Krishna Menon, that a republic could remain in the Commonwealth, accepting the Queen in her capacity as head of the Commonwealth, but not, of course, as head of the government of India once India became a republic. That was the very formula, I think, being alluded to in the context of Ireland. But then, of course, the original British colony of the United States has never joined the Commonwealth either. So I suppose the Irish are in good company. I do accept and agree with Dr. Katuria's point earlier that Brexit was much less about economics and much more about immigration, culture, and values, which is a polite way of saying that a lot of bigotry came out during that campaign, and that much of it was a rejection by British voters of the foreigners in their midst. And the irony is that the places in Britain where there are large numbers of foreigners actually voted to remain, London and the home counties in particular. It's once you got into the areas where they heard about the foreigners but didn't actually have many of them in their midst that voted against them. But such are the contradictions of direct democracy. Now let's look at the implications of Brexit for the Commonwealth, since that was what the topic given to me suggested. The first and most obvious consequence of Brexit was an immediate fall in the value of the pound sterling. And that had three potential consequences for the Commonwealth countries. The first, of course, would be the impact on exports to the UK by Commonwealth countries. We've actually seen that 6 Commonwealth countries actually find that the UK accounts for more than 10% of their trade, and one, Botswana, has 50%, more than 50% of its trade with the UK. So for them, this is a rather serious challenge. The second consequence, though I think it's too early to measure entirely, anecdotally it can be measured already, is the likely decline in British tourism to Commonwealth countries because of both the slowing economy and disposable income in the hands of British tourists, and of course the fall in the value of the pound, which was quite striking. I think it went from $1.42 to $1.18 within a matter of days. So clearly the British tourists would come out in fewer numbers, and speaking as a member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, we certainly have fewer Brits on the beaches of Kovalam this December, and I dare say that may well be replicated in other places that the Brits have tended to go to. Maybe somebody will look at the numbers in Goa as well. So that's a second impact on the Commonwealth countries. It's striking that the UK is amongst the top 3 sources of tourism for more than 60% of the Commonwealth countries. So that's not an inconsiderable impact. The third direct impact, I think, would be that the slowing economy and tightening immigration could, of course, reduce the employment of Commonwealth nationals, or foreigners generally, of course, in the UK, and thereby reduce the remittances they send back. There is an estimate that Commonwealth citizens working in the UK remit something like £12 billion a year to their home countries. So there will be lower amounts coming, and of course they'll buy less in local currencies, since with the decline in the value of the pound, there'll be less money translating into the hands of those recipients of these remittances. So that again, obviously for a country like India, we get far more remittances from our hardworking blue-collar workers in the Gulf than from relatively well-off business people or nurses or whatever in the UK. But the fact still is that for many other countries, the West Indies in particular, some of the African countries, this is not an inconsiderable consequence. While I'm on these sort of negatives of the impact, of the direct impact of Brexit, I think one has to look at the potential for the improved relationship with the Commonwealth that some have cited as a likely positive outcome of Brexit. I have to say that we in India, for example, do have to think very hard about what we've seen in terms of the restrictions on Indians, in particular Indian students, placed by the present Prime Minister, Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary. And the very severe restrictions on post-study work arrangements in the UK, which have led to a 50% decline over 5 years in the number of Indian students in the UK, from about 40,000 5 years ago to about 20,000 today. That contrasts with over 100,000 in the US, for example. And that's